Hi everyone, I'm Brenda Radchik, a Mexican horror writer, and I'll be your moderator today. Please, could you tell me a bit about yourselves, and then we'll start with the questions. Should we start with you, Akiva?
Sure, that's fine. I am Akiva Hoffman. I write dark fantasy. I don't have anything in stores at the moment in that vein, but I did just have a critical essay come out in the collection you see over my shoulder here. Jewish Fantasy Worldwide is kind of an academic collection, so I encourage people to seek it at a library if you'd like to read it. But my essay is on queer Jewish speculative fiction. And I'm excited about this panel because we've had some issues with book banning in my hometown of Dearborn, Michigan, in the United States, and got some interesting stuff to share about that. I'm going to pass the mic to RJ.
Hi, yes, I'm really excited about that collection. I've already mentally added it to my list of things to buy. So I am RJ Joseph. I am a creative and academic writer, mostly writing horror these days. I do write romance also on occasion, and I'm really excited to be here. This is a very important topic.
Thank you, RJ. Would you like to continue, Kristin?
Sure. I'm Kristin Jacques. I'm a author of fantasy for teens and adults, and I also write queer romance. And I'm excited to be on this panel.
And hi, I'm Keshe Chow. I write fantasy as well. I have a book coming out, my debut novel, The Girl with No Reflection, coming out next year with Delacorte. But I'm also an adult fantasy writer, and I also do short stories and a little bit of poetry. And I'm obviously from Australia, as you can probably tell from my broad Aussie accent. And we don't really have so much discourse about book banning or censorship in Australia. So I guess I'll be providing the outside of the US perspective on this topic. But, I feel like it's probably coming for us. So I think it's going to be really interesting hearing you guys in the States and what your perspective is as well.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Should we start by discussing what's the difference between book banning and censorship, if you think there's a difference?
Yeah, I can talk about it if you like. I feel like book banning kind of comes under the umbrella of censorship. I mean, I don't really strictly know the definitions, but I feel like there's so many different ways that censorship can be applied, and book banning is kind of just either comes under that umbrella or maybe it's kind of like along the spectrum. And I wanted to share a little story, if that's okay, that I actually got permission from one of my friends to share. So one of my friends, Al Hess, is a transgender author who published his book in February this year called World Running Down, published through Angry Robot Books, and it's amazing, so everyone should read it. But what he told me was that when he looked up his categories on Amazon, he noticed that this book had been classified as being, I think it was like transgender erotic romance, which at first he thought was kind of funny. Like, it's actually it's a cozy sci-fi fantasy book. There's one sex scene. It's not at all graphic. It's very tastefully done. It's not anywhere near what you classify as being erotica, but yet it was classified into this section. And then later, when he started looking through this actual category, he found that like a lot of trans books were being classified into these erotica sections, which, even if they had no sexual content at all, which I thought was really like interesting and awful, because like being classified into those erotic categories means that there's restrictions on how you can advertise and how much reach you get organically. Like it's very suppressed, those books. And so it's kind of like implying that just by being trans or queer, you are automatically seen as being erotic, which is kind of completely wrong. And so, it's just a form of censorship that's very insidious. So I think, for so long, all of this censorship has been happening, and it's been happening for a long time behind the scenes and very insidiously and kind of, like not in a visible way. And I feel like this has just kind of snowballed into this effect where behind the scenes censorship was happening. but then it became more and more visible. And I guess in the US, there's a bit of like more visibility of conservative politics and things. It's kind of just come to a head where it's become really public. And now all these people are feeling empowered to come out and say, we were doing it on the fly before, but now we're going to come out and say, actually, like, no, we feel like we're brave enough now to say we want these books completely banned. So I sort of feel like it's kind of just, reaching the end of the spectrum. And so they're sort of like tied together. But I think censorship has been a great issue for a very, very long time.
It's interesting that you say that there's like this ongoing insidious censorship, because I agree that it's also not so insidious. There's some very outward censorship that's been ongoing for decades within the media, like between imports and exports. Like other countries will censor like the media that is coming in for like LGBTQ matter because it's illegal in that country. And, even just like violence in cartoons that come to our country is censored because they want to make it kid friendly. So it's definitely an ongoing issue that's just been existing. And I think that it's just been getting more attention because it's become so politically charged. But I did have a definition. Censorship is the suppression or the prohibition of a part of the source material, whereas banning is the removal of the materials. And that's like the fine line difference.
That's a good characterization. If I can jump off of what you two have been saying, because I was thinking of my own usage of the terms, and like a ban is when something has been removed, either oftentimes it's from libraries or from stores, possibly, where it was formerly available. So it's like you could go to the place to get something, and it's now that book is not available there. Whereas, censorship is very broad. And I'm glad you reminded us of the insidious kind of nature, because I was just talking to someone at a convention who was saying that, her friends who write LGBT fiction, their Facebook ads get pulled, even though they're more tame than the standard romance covered with, man and woman, bodice ripper, sort of whatever, thing. Those heterosexual pairings are fine on Facebook ads, but for some reason they're seeing ads pulled for, LGBT, same-sex relationship books, which is like, okay, that's weird. So that's kind of the insidious level that people may not see, but there's also this very official aspect that some governments have a censor's office. Like when I was traveling in the Middle East several years ago, I met a guy who worked for the censor's office in Lebanon, and they had to watch all the R-rated films that were being considered for display and choose which parts they were going to cut or whether to allow those films to be displayed at all. And I think we hear about certain countries like China has some pretty significant censorship. Russia does, and India has an increasing amount of censorship around religious issues that are very active these days. But I suspect there's probably a lot of countries where this happens that maybe don't have such a large population or something that we just don't hear about it.
Absolutely.
I think that, sorry.
Go on.
I was just going to say, I know that there's certain countries where if there's any queer content at all, the books have to be wrapped in like brown paper, almost like they're, I think like Bunny Dean, who did the book Eaters, like sold into, I think it was Russia, Akiva, do you remember? And basically the stipulation was because there was lesbian content, it had to be sold like wrapped in brown paper as though it was kind of like, like R-rated, even though it really isn't. So.
Yeah, I can't add anything to those awesome insights. It really is a situation where the book banning, I think, is just like a different leg of censorship, and it's one that unfortunately is gaining steam. It's terrible that it's actually working. So I think that we have a big fight ahead of us to keep that from happening.
And is there ever a justification for it? What do you think, RJ?
I don't. And so here's the thing. It's kind of this cyclical thing that happens. Like, this is not the first time that books or education, because I work in academia. And so I see that these are very correlated, these ideas, that certain people, certain ethnicities, certain gender expressions, certain groups of people just aren't supposed to exist even. And so what happens is it starts with the education. We start with the children. We start saying, oh, it's not good. Think of the children. And so in the name of protecting children. They just kind of they shuttle all of these undesirable elements. And so what happens is the children are not exposed to these stories. They're not exposed to these voices. And so then they go through the educational system not having this exposure. And then they become adults who are not, who don't have this experience. And so it's a lot easier to then say, well, see, you don't even know about this. This is subversive because you never even learned about it. If it were valid and something that we should know, then you would have learned it. But since you didn't, we have to continue to keep this element out. And so it is very, very insidious, as a couple of you said before, because this is why it is starting in the schools. It's specifically attacking education so that you can have an ignorant populace. Like that is the goal.
Can I add a data point to that? So there's an organization called PEN America, like a pen you write with, or it's at pen.org, and they have a lot of great information on censorship. They put together a report called Banned in the USA, the growing movement to censor books in schools. And I was just looking at this before our panel, and almost 90% of the books that have been banned in the United States in the last couple of years have been children's and young adult books. So there are some books written for adults like Brave New World in 1984 that get banned, but for the most part, it's stuff written specifically for young people. So that moral panic aspect of save the children is definitely a big rallying cry by people that are pushing these things. And now, if you talk about justifications, I think in the case of schools, it is valid to talk about what is age appropriate for a school library, and are there books that represent an imminent threat to safety? For instance, should a bomb-making manual be in a school library? I don't think so. Okay. But you know what? School librarians are professionals, and they don't order bomb-making manuals to put in the school library. And generally speaking, city librarians don't do that either. So these aren't the books that I'm hearing being brought up. You know, other data has I think that same report was 41% of the books that are being banned have LGBT content. About the same percent have a representation of ethnic or racial minorities. So like RJ was saying, there's certain content that people want to suppress, and it has to do with a moral panic. It doesn't have to do with actual threats or actual safety going on.
From the flip side, I wanted to hear, oh, sorry, Kristin, you go ahead.
That's okay, go ahead.
I was just going to ask the panel's opinion on censorship from the point of view of, I guess, classic novels. You know, there's a little bit of a discourse recently about Roald Dahl and, some of the more, I guess, racist and sexist commentary or little content that kind of just slip through as they're the product of, I guess, the era that these, and Enid Blyton is another one. And I've got 2 little kids, so I read them a lot of the books, and they've actually, the books that my partner had when he was a child, so they are the old versions, the versions that were from the original. And I guess, I'm a bit torn with that sort of thing, because when I read these books aloud to my kids, I do kind of consciously change the language. There's things where I just will sort of for instance, I'll change the word golly to dolly. I'll just say Mr. Dolly, and, I guess that may be, to me, a situation where censorship is justified, because it's, people often say when you're sort of showing these stories to kids, you should, use it to start a launch pad, a discussion on how we don't use that language anymore. But my kids were 3 and 4, they're not really developmentally able to grasp that concept of this is a product of an older era that we don't really agree with anymore. They just don't. They're not there yet. And my now 7-year-old is probably getting to that level, so we can have those conversations. But when they were littler, I was just I would rather this just not be in the book. So I'm interested to hear the panel's opinions on that side of things. Do we censor more, I guess, hate speech and more sort of things that do actually present a threat to people's, identity?
It's actually perfect for me to kind of jump in, because my viewpoint on it was in America, one of our root issues is the fact that there's such a wide interpretation of the First Amendment. and how both sides kind of use that to justify banning and censorship for their own gain. But it means that you have things like a palm-making novel being put in the same category as The Handmaid's Tale when it's apples to oranges. And the fact that there are censored editions kind of being pushed out of older classics using that justification. But at the same time, the First Amendment it's never been updated for its purpose. Like it was originally, the whole point of it was for, people to be able to speak freely and convene freely without being like torn into by their own government, because we were emerging from a monarchy, and now we have this whole system set in place where all this subversive censorship is happening.
Yeah, so I think that I'm a bit of a hippie, and I always have been. So being in academia, I teach English, and so that's writing classes, literature classes, and things like that. And even if one of our learning objectives was not for every one of these classes to foster critical thinking skills, even if that wasn't one of the objectives, that's just one of my personal objectives towards world domination. And so even as I raise my children, who are now young adults and older teenagers, even when they were younger, I didn't try to shield them from things like these classics, like what you were talking about before. Is it Keshe? Keshe. Yeah. So what you were talking about before, that's totally age appropriate. That's a different thing. But like if they were old enough to read, let's say, I hate to say H.P. Lovecraft. I've never dug that work, right? I don't like it. I don't teach it. I like the ideas, but I don't really care for the writing itself. But let's say if I wanted to use that in class, I, as an academic, am very, very dedicated to helping my students to critically think through whatever they're faced with. So I don't feel threatened. I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, but I don't feel that they won't be able to face these things and be able to think it through and say, okay, maybe this is not a great idea, or maybe this is a thing that we shouldn't do. But again, I think that that's what happens when we say as widespread, we just want to take some things out of circulation. If we are actually teaching people to think critically about the ideas that they're engaging with the things that they're faced with, then I don't think we would have to worry about them not being able to make an informed choice. That said, again, that is one of the reasons why there's a huge population that does not want the introduction of critical thinking. And they don't want people to be able to think about whether or not these ideas have value or whether or not they can dismiss them. Because in an ideal society, I think that we all could be faced with things and we could very much emphatically say, yeah, no, we just don't like that. You can write it if you want to, but we're not going to engage with it because we don't like it. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal society, right?
I'm glad you raised the question because I do think there's a difference between book banning and that kind of like top-down censorship versus decisions you make within your home for what your kids could handle. Because I think everybody's got to do that. And that's actually part of the pushback that we've been trying to do here in Dearborn and say, look, if you don't want your kid to read certain books, there's a process for that. You can give a list to the library at the school, and they won't let your kid check those books out. They've had that process in place for a long time, but don't take away something that other people might want access to. So, with the question of like, is it okay to change stuff? Take a longer time scale, not just Roald Dahl or whatever, but like the classics, Greek mythology. We want to introduce our child to Greek mythology, but we don't want all the rape. Okay, so we're going to use a bowdlerized version of that. My 8-year-old has been learning about Gilgamesh, and reading a nice picture book based on the Gilgamesh epic, but it has certain stuff that's not there, for reasons, because that's an age appropriateness issue. And when he's older, if he wants to read a more authentic translation, that's fine. But I think that's more that's a bowdlerization approach, where you I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but where you kind of like simplify it or clean it up, So I guess depending on the age of the kid, there's a time and place for that, but I don't think we should get rid of the original versions of it and not have them available in libraries for that critical thinking kind of stuff that RJ was talking about. And not everybody would do this, but when I was in college, I had a professor that assigned us to do rhetorical analysis on a chapter of Mein Kampf. And it was really bad argumentation, but, a lot of emotional appeals that clearly resonated with people in Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you say that, because it's important. Like, it's important to be faced with these things, and that's one thing I love about analysis in these classes. And this is a thing that I wish that we had more of outside of academia. But being able to do that type of analysis, understand the rhetoric first of all, so that we know why it worked. But also so that we understand why it is bad faith argumentation, right? And so I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's really important.
So, who decides that a book is banned? How does this happen?
Someone had already answered it when they were talking about the fact that parents are often the ones who are coming forward and like challenging and putting forth the ban option for books. So it's like, when I was looking it up, like the highest percentage was parent groups. That is unfortunately something that is very prevalent, is that parents will go after the whole library instead of minding it in the home.
If I could talk about our local example here in Dearborn, Michigan, this is about public school libraries. In the United States, public schools are run by local school boards that have ultimate authority over funding and decisions, including the school libraries. So it's not like someone at the state level or the federal level decides what's going to be in a library. It's very local, and you have local elections to put these people in there. And here in Dearborn, we had a lot of aggression on display at school board meetings last fall. The timing was significant because it was in the run-up to state and local elections, including electing a governor. And these were whipped up by people, parents of kids in the district, who falsely claimed that librarians were forcing pornography on children. And in one of these meetings, hundreds of angry men actually shut down the meeting because they were so loud and disruptive that nothing could get done. So some friends and I were trying to support the school librarians who had ordered the books in the first place. And so we would do things like speak at the school board meeting, email the school board, try to get journalists to interview us. And we actually threw a counter protest in support of books at one point. But we felt like the board was really trying to play it down the middle, which meant they're pandering to bullies at a certain point. But ultimately, the hate that was on display wasn't about books. So books were a pretext. It was about not wanting to share space with LGBT kids and teachers and allies of LGBT folks. It seems that some people are just infuriated by freedoms or identities that they don't identify with. And, fine. They had that process that I mentioned earlier where they could say, I don't want my kid to have this book and that book and whatever. But these people would not be satisfied until they could get those books away from kids who need them, from kids who see themselves reflected in the kinds of characters and stories being told. So what happened here is, over a period of months and acrimonious board meetings and whatever, and a lot of fighting on social media where the people pushing this started calling everybody a groomer and a pedophile, that the mayor spoke out in favor of, libraries and freedom of speech, and they started calling him a groomer and stuff. It was very bad. But over time, the librarians reviewed these books that had been challenged. I think it was about 7 books that were challenged. They decided to remove a few of the books and keep others. So, those books are banned, essentially. In one case, they moved a book from the middle school libraries to high school libraries, saying, okay, well, maybe it's a bit too mature for middle schoolers. That's the 6th through 8th grade. I don't know what form that would be in England, or I don't know if Australia is the same system. But they said it's fine for 9th graders and up. Most of the books that were being challenged depicted LGBTQ relationships. A couple that people may have heard of that were removed or banned by the school include Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and Push by Sapphire, which there was a movie based on that as well that came out. So I was pretty frustrated that they banned any of the books in question. But something that's weird is they also created a process where you could appeal if they decided to keep a book in the library and you still think they should take it away. But that means offering to serve on a committee to review it. None of these books they kept that had been objected to in board meetings were appealed, because if they were appealed, those parents would actually have to read the book. It's one thing to stand up at a board meeting and say, oh, this book is pornographic and blah, 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 blah. But if you actually have to sit down with a committee and read cover to cover and discuss it with other people, they didn't want to go there. So ultimately, the librarians and the school board had to make the decision to take them away. But it was parents that instigated it. But these parents are networked nationwide with other groups through like Moms for Liberty. There's a review site called like Book Looks or something like that they use. It's not a authoritative review site. It's just like looking for content to be angry about and say, oh, look, they're indoctrinating your child. You need to get this out of the library. So yeah, it starts, there's like this, a little bit of a faux grassroots thing, that's very networked and has people funding it, but also then it requires a decision maker to kowtow to the whims of this group of angry people.
It's interesting you said that a lot of times they haven't even read the book, so they don't even know what the content is. They're just making an assumption. And actually, there's an author from Australia who was a refugee called Ando, and he's amazing. He's also a stand-up comedian, and he's an accomplished artist. He won the Art Nobel Prize, which is an amazing, like a really prestigious portrait prize in Australia. But he's written a whole bunch of book series for kids that I read to my own daughter. And they're fantastic. There's like Ninja Kid, there's like ones about dragons, there's Book Girl. And they're literally just kids having adventures. Like they're not even like focused on any race issues. There's no queer content. It's just like Book Girl is just about a girl who is in a dystopian society and then makes friends with a bunch of dogs, like a pack of dogs. And even those books are being banned in the US. And it's just purely because the author identity is that he's marginalized. He's a person of color and he's a refugee. And then, so the justification is we don't want to, have these books written by people that could be seen to alienate other members of the community. But then, they're alienating whole entire marginalized communities by not allowing us the voice or allowing, these books to be, in their libraries or their schools, and not allowing sort of whole groups of kids to see themselves on the page. So it's kind of like, they're saying these books will be divisive, but taking them out is more divisive. Like it just doesn't even make any sense, their argument. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense that they probably haven't even read the book. They just make an assumption based on the fact that this author is a refugee, that he will be, talking about race issues. But it's not like that. It's just literally kids having adventures. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, and I live in Texas. I feel like that's really the end of the conversation, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Basically, it's the same thing. The same thing is happening here. What is also curious, though, is there is a library. I can't remember which Texan town. They actually were going to literally just shut the library down rather than have books there that they just didn't want there. But what has also happened, because I agree that it is totally this grassroots kind of a thing, but it all is ultimately, as Kristin mentioned earlier, it's all ultimately tied back to politics. Because we just had here in the area where I live right outside of Houston. Houston ISD is the largest school district here in Texas, and it is comprised of predominantly students of color. And so it just so happens that it also is one of the more politically diverse areas here in the state. And so the government has just taken over the school district. Yes, they have done this under the guise of low performance, but they are not performing much lower than other districts. And so it's starting to become really clear to see what this bigger picture is. Again, if you control the education, if you control what is in the schools, and if you do that, then you can literally control the populace. And so it's really frustrating because I totally think that parents should have the right to think about what they want their kids to be exposed to. But I also think that they don't have the right to tell me what my kids can be exposed to, though. And so when they insist that these books come out, I mean, again, it's a faulty argument. And I think that they know that it's faulty, right? Like it's illogical. It's based on lots of fallacies. But I don't think that the people who are pushing these things care about that. They really don't. If they really cared about keeping children safe, we would be having conversations about things that are not books. We would be, and even if we talked about the books, we would be talking about this whole princess fairy tale, everybody needs to be married kind of thing. Like, to me, that's more dangerous. Like, to my kids, right? Like, I don't want you to buy into that whole thing. So if it really was about the kids, if it was really a moral imperative to keep them safe and pure, this is not what we'd be talking about. We'd be talking about a whole lot of other stuff.
That book is not going to jump off the shelf and make your kid gay.
And I agree, it's more about the censoring of ideas than it is about the censoring of the material. And it's very twisted logic, because suppressing those ideas is not going to stop your kids from eventually having ideas.
Yeah, that's totally true. Like, because kids are going to be seeking out that information, but maybe from the wrong sources, from sources that aren't sort of in mainstream media, from the internet, which is just like, anything goes on there. And so it's almost opening them up to more sort of, to more danger. And also, individuals who share those identities, opening them up to a lot of personal danger, because they're feeling invalidated, like their identity isn't valid. And that can lead to, a whole host of mental health issues and even, worse. And I think that it is political, because, I see from where I sit, in Australia, looking at the US from the outside, there definitely seems to be a sort of a trend towards people who are on the conservative side, just feeling more enabled to speak out as time goes on. And I don't know why that is. I just see it more and more that they're just like, they always had those views, but maybe they kind of hit it more in the past. I guess with certain political figures, they've come out and feel like courageous now to be able to actually verbalize their prejudices, and feel like that there is this whole grassroots campaign that supports them.
You want to answer that one, RJ?
Yeah, oh gosh, I traveled to Europe like in 2017, and the one question that I got, which I was really surprised about, I didn't get the whole, oh, you're Black question. Because I was in Romania, right? So that was a whole thing. The question that I got was, what is going on with you all over there with this presidential election? And I think that, of course, these ideas have always existed, but there has been an emboldenment, because the people that we are told we're supposed to trust with making these decisions in our government, they have become emboldened. There's a whole new contingent there that whereas before they were feeling like, well, maybe we shouldn't publicize these ideas. Maybe we shouldn't talk about them out in polite company, right? We should only talk about it in our closed meetings. They have indeed become emboldened. There's always a resurgence of these kinds of things. And I'm not a historian, that is not my discipline. But there are waves. These things travel in waves. As soon as there is some progress made on some fronts, you always get this huge backlash against that progress that kind of tries to not just like stifle it, but like to actually staunch it, like cut it off. And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing here. And there's also the idea that some of the that the ways that they've approached it, like they haven't always approached, like when during the civil rights movement, when they were trying to integrate the schools, they did not talk about much that there was the argument was that the kids wouldn't be safe. Right. These kids won't be safe if we let the little Black kids come. It was more of we just don't want them using the resources. But I think that what has also happened is that they found out that if you use the kids, that kind of helps to be sort of a blanket in order to do all this other stuff kind of undercover. There is a very concerted effort to just go straight to the root of this. Because it's kind of hard to fight against that if you say, well, no, it makes it, well, you don't want to protect kids. So when you argue against it, it's like you're arguing against the kids. And that's like logical fallacy. What is that? Straw man fallacy, like all day long. So what I find really peculiar also is that some of the books that are being banned are age-appropriate books that, for instance, talk about children's bodies, right? They talk about the anatomy and the parts of the bodies. And I'm really, really frightened at what this is going to do for children's safety. Because if they don't know what their bodies are supposed to do, if they don't know that they have agency over their bodies, it's really just setting them up for abuse. And it doesn't escape me that a lot of situations where children are sexually abused, it's coming out of certain communities. It's coming out of certain contingents. These are the same people who don't want the kids to be educated in the first place. And so when you talk about groomers, of course, I'm thinking, hello, beauty pageants? Are you kidding me? Like, this is grooming all day long. So like, you're worried about the queer community, and we need to be worried about this community that talks about purity culture and making alliances to your father. And I mean, it's just really weird. And we're setting the kids up. The kids will not know anything. So it's not just that they won't know about Black people or Muslim people or queer people. They're also not going to know about themselves. And so then they can't protect themselves against sexual abuse. And again, I can't help but feel that that's part of the design, even though that's the part that nobody's going to say out loud. They're not going to say that out loud.
But that's a pattern you see with right-wing people. Sorry, I just wanted to hop on this one thing and I'll pass it like, this pattern of projection, the psychological principle of projection, when they accuse people of something outrageous, so many times it's like, wait, that's kind of a problem. Who was it? Jesus that said, like, don't judge other people lest you be judged. And like, if you're trying to get that splinter out of your friend's eye, look for the big stick that's in yours or whatever. Because we see so many like this right-wing politician, this youth pastor, this whatever, that were actually committing sex crimes against minors. But they're the ones accusing us of being groomers.
Yeah, how can readers and authors combat this form of censorship? Would you like to start, Keshe?
So I mean, I guess there's a lot of like authors that are sort of very vocally kind of, using their platforms to speak out against this censorship. I'm thinking of Kelly Yang, who's I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but who's an American Asian author of middle grade fiction, who started a non-profit organization, basically donating a lot of the banned books to libraries and schools and things, and also is using her platform, which is considerable, to spread the word about what's happening, because a lot of people probably outside of the book community don't even really know to the granular level what, we're keeping an eye on the pulse, because we're in the literary community. We fear for our own sort of voices and things like that. But if you're just an average person, living your life, you probably don't really, probably not as aware of that this is happening to the deep level that we would be aware of it. But then on the flip side, those sort of authors that do have platforms, they are able to fight it and speak out about it because they are at that level. They're sort of advanced enough in their careers that, she's a New York Times bestselling author. She probably feels quite secure in her author career. Whereas if you're sort of a debut or just starting out or emerging, or you're trying to get published, or you're very marginalized yourself, like, those authors aren't going to feel safe sort of speaking out and fighting publicly against a system that's sort of, so huge and beyond the size of this, one author.
There's a lot of onus put on the the reading community, as it were, to help to use their social media platforms, as it were, to help spread the word. Aside from the authors doing it themselves. And you're right, though. It is kind of scary how outside the book community, a lot of people don't know this, and it kind of ties back into the fact that, where, as you were saying, kids are kind of being cut out from this, and they're being almost dumbed down through the suppression of critical thinking. And honestly, we have kids going into community colleges right now who cannot read. So it is.
I have them in my class.
Systemic issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would say if you're in a community where people are organizing to ban books, write letters to your civic leaders or your school board leaders. I mean, it plays a little differently if it's public libraries versus school libraries, but write letters to the decision makers, show up and support the librarians who are defending books, speak up if you can, speak at school board meetings or city council meetings or state board of education meetings. There's usually a public comment portion, at least in the United States. That's how these things are run. So you can, sit through the meeting and get up and give your 3-minute comments or whatever. You really want to make sure the decision makers know that they are going to be held accountable for the way they treat anyone of marginalized identity, whether that's LGBT folks, ethnic or racial minorities, religious minorities, including atheists. Just, down the line, they need to know you're going to hold them accountable for that. And also, it's important to talk to your friends, relatives, and neighbors about why people need to see themselves represented in the books they read. Particularly young people need to see characters like themselves, to know that there's a place in the world for them and that they shouldn't just absorb the negative messages from society. And it's also good to check in with marginalized people who are the sort of people that are in the books that are being attacked, because this kind of has a knock-on effect of making people feel unwelcome in their own community. I do think it's good to expose the lies that are told by people who are misrepresenting what's in these books. It's a little dicey because of the whole bullshit asymmetry principle. I mean, if you tell a lie that's big enough, it, directly arguing against the lie seems like a losing battle. If you can expose it a little bit, but present the truth about it is the bigger deal. And at a certain point, if you have the privilege or resources to do so, I think it's totally fair to expose and shame the character failings of the people who want to dictate morals to the rest of us. Because a lot of these people have skeletons hidden under their bed or whatever, it's like they need to be pointed out for like the fact that they're hypocrites. And if you want data or resources for organizing people in your community, if you're in the United States at least, go to ALA.org. That's the American Library Association. They have a lot of good resources on this. And as I mentioned before, PEN.org, that's PEN America Foundation. There's some great data and suggestions for organizing stuff.
So I think as writers, the first thing that we should do is keep writing. I know that for those of us that are that come from marginalized communities, it's just important that we tell our stories anyway. And so we need to tell them, we need to get them out there. But also, I think it's important that publishing gatekeepers not kowtow to the bullies. I like the way that you said that earlier, Akiva, like cannot placate the bullies. And I think that sometimes that's what we see. That's why publishing is so slow to actually offer true inclusivity. And that there's still, we're doing better, but there's still so much work to be done, because what happens is they start to get pushback and they go, well, nobody's going to buy these books if we publish them. And I don't think that that's the case. So I think that the gatekeepers are going to have to stand up, do a better job at including these diverse voices. But then we really ultimately just need to keep writing and keep telling our stories. That's going to be huge, because once this is over, once this wave passes, we still need to have the stories. There still need to be books that can be read.
Readers find their way to the stories they need. So it's very important for, as you said, for writers to keep writing. And definitely about the gatekeepers, part of the problem with publishing in general, and like especially with the big 4 or 5, whatever is left, is the fact that as the further you travel the money line, the more you realize it's all owned by billionaires that kind of like have interesting political leanings.
Yeah, and how much, guided by figures, essentially. So it's like if a book by a marginalized author underperforms once, then that's it. The next time another book from that community goes to acquisition, it'll be like, well, this one wasn't profitable. So, and there's so many different reasons why books don't perform. And it's not solely confined to marginalized communities, yet it's always marginalized communities who end up bearing the brunt of or carrying this legacy of underperform. You can have a book that's completely mainstream that's not from a marginalized author that underperforms, and then that's fine. The next time someone comes along, they'll still acquire it. But yeah, when it's from like a person of color or queer person or whatever, like it's like, oh no, that's these books don't sell.
Well, RJ already kind of answered this question, but I don't know if anyone else would like to add something else about what should new and working authors consider during this period of book banning.
I don't think I can add anything to what RJ so eloquently already said. I think just, keep telling our stories and just keep educating as much as we can and, trying to reach the audience and the children that, are going to be the next generation that will lead the countries and lead the world, basically.
I would encourage every writer to find their people. Every author needs a supportive community, but especially if you have any marginalization in the society that you live in. And so if someone's a non-white author or a woman or non-binary or queer, there's extra chances that people will hate you, despite just the normal things this career can do to grind you down. So find your people, find supportive community, and be there for each other. I know quite a few authors that many who don't read their reviews. They're like, I get feedback from my editor. I don't pay attention to reviews because some of them are very negative and just want to tear things down. And there are reviewers that just want to tear people down for superficial reasons, especially if that's an author that has any societal marginalization going on to begin with. There's something that I haven't seen done a lot, but some people have gotten a super fan or another author to read their reviews and send them the best ones, or kind of help out with that so they don't have to go, looking for pain, basically.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I think I do want to add to that. It's important for us as writers to not do this work for these people, right? Like sometimes we start to get in our little smaller groups and we start to kind of nitpick and rah at each other, and that is so harmful because then we do their job for them. When we decide that certain person's book should not be out there, or this author is too old, or this author is too young, this author's too something, this idea for this anthology is not a great idea, right? Like we kind of need to be sure that we're making room for everyone, for each other, because once we have that infighting within our groups, that just really makes it easier for us to fall down. So we have to be really careful about that. Now, this is not saying that we need to allow every bad actor and bad faith participant into our inner ranks, but I think that we just really need to be careful that we aren't also, setting up censorship within our groups.
I think when you first said, making sure we're not doing the work for them being the bullies, I thought you meant, and your point was amazing. And I definitely agree with that, not to have the infighting amongst our own communities. But I thought you actually meant don't do the emotional labor for them, for their growth and their learning and their education. Because I think that's also an important point that I'd like to add, that sometimes doing the education can be really taxing on yourself as the marginalized person. And so if I think there's, I guess sometimes I see members of marginalized communities jumping on other members of marginalized communities for not speaking out, for not doing more, for not doing more work. But, you don't know what that person's situation is. They could be really struggling, with this emotional labor and the toll that it takes on you. So I think being kind to everyone, whether or not they are out there being an activist or they're sort of, trying to avoid it, I think that's an important thing as well.
Yes, that is an excellent point. Yes.
Very good points. I love that. What is a banned book that you highly recommend reading?
All of
Kristin, would you? Oh, okay.
I was just gonna say, there's so many, right? It's hard to single out anyone. I feel others might have better suggestions than me.
I recommend 1984. And
So,
The Giver, which gets banned surprising amount of times.
It's kind of hard to pick, but one that people may be less familiar with is called The 57 Bus by Dashka Slater. It is a nonfiction book, actually, about youth in Oakland, California, and it deals with both gender issues and race and the carceral state and so on. It's quite thought-provoking. But also, I used to work in a bookstore, and I would usually ask someone so what kind of books do you like? And, encourage people to Google most frequently banned books or whatever and pick something that is, suited to their taste, or if they want to push themselves a little, something that represents people who they may not know as well or have in their life.
Yeah, so I've seen, I don't keep up with those things because I can only imagine which books would be banned. Those are the ones I'd probably read anyway. But I would highly recommend I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. It does talk about sexual abuse, but it is a brilliantly beautiful coming of age story. It had a really big impact on me when I was young, but also as the writer who I am now, because it talks a lot about how words are important. And that's kind of the crux of what we're talking about: words, learning, education, telling stories. So I would recommend that one. It seems to kind of fall off and on these lists, like at the times that I would look at them, but I don't know that it's currently banned. I mean, it probably is because I mean, Black, right, and woman, right. So I don't know.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to record this panel. You were all wonderful.